Past research has demonstrated that unbelievable headlines are more recognizable than believable headlines. Furthermore, unbelievable headlines become more believable over time. Epstein and others also found that headline source affects the believability of headlines. For the current study, we wanted to examine if media primes and headline source combine to affect the believability and recognition of believable and unbelievable news headlines. We also wanted to examine the effect of news source and a priming condition on the believability and recognition of both believable and unbelievable headlines over time. For the hypotheses, we expected Washington Post headlines to become more believable relative to other news sources, particularly in relation to the National Enquirer. We also expected Washington Post headlines to become less believable over time, especially if the source was removed at time 2. Regardless of source, unbelievable headlines were expected to be recognized better than believable headlines. The Washington Post priming condition was expected to increase headline believability, and the National Enquirer and Twitter priming conditions were expected to decrease headline believability. Participants were predominantly students between the ages of 18 to 23 years old from a small, public, liberal arts university in the southeastern United States who were seeking research credit. We have data collected from 322 participants. At time 1, participants were asked to read and sign a consent form. Next, they received a packet of questionnaires that consisted of a basic demographics form, a media consumption questionnaire, and the paranormal belief scale. After participants completed the questionnaire, they were primed with one of 4 headline sources: Twitter, the Washington Post, the National Enquirer, or no labeled source, and were asked to complete simple math problems which served as a control. Next, participants were asked to rate 24 headlines with the headline believability scale ranging from -3, extremely unbelievable, to 3, extremely believable. There were 12 believable headlines and 12 unbelievable headlines. The packets were counterbalanced using a Latin square. 48 hours later, participants returned to complete Part 2. Participants were asked to rate 48 headlines with the same believability scale used at time 1. In addition to the original 24 headlines participants were exposed to in time 1, they were exposed to 24 new headlines, 12 new believable headlines, and 12 new unbelievable headlines, which served as foils. Participants were then asked to circle any headlines they recognized from time 1. Next, participants were asked to complete a religiosity and spirituality scale. Finally, participants were adequately debriefed and given a debriefing form. So as far as results go, the first figure shows how the removal of source from time 2 impacts believability. Figure 2 shows the believability of believable headlines by source. In the beginning of the packet, we told participants that Twitter was a social media platform, that the National Enquirer was an unreliable source, and the Washington Post was a reliable source. Twitter and the National Enquirer had the lowest numbers for believability. Having the name of the source connected to the headline either raised or lowered the headline believability. When the Washington Post was connected to a headline, participants found it more believable. Figure 3 shows the believability of unbelievable headlines by source. The unbelievable headlines become more believable in time 2 when the source was removed. Figure 4 looks at recognition across believable and unbelievable headlines by source. We were looking at how recognizable, believable, and unbelievable headlines were over time. If a participant read a Washington Post true headline, it did not really stand out, so they did not recognize it very well. The true Washington Post headlines were the lowest recognized out of all the other headlines because they did not stand out. The Washington Post rumored to recognize because they were coming from a reputable source. The unbelievable headlines were recognized more because they were out of the ordinary. Figure 5 shows recognition for Twitter Prime across sources. Twitter Prime inhibited recognition for headlines of Twitter sources. When the headlines were encoded, they had sources attached. When retrieved for time 2, they had sources removed. This created a mismatched situation that created a lack of encoding specificity. The two-way interaction was not significant, however, when participants were primed through recognition of headlines that were inhibited for Twitter sources. Graph 6 shows recognition for National Enquirer across sources. National Enquirer were lower when they were primed with the National Enquirer. Graph 7 shows recognition for Washington Post prime across sources. Washington Post were lower when they were primed with Washington Post. And Graph 8 shows recognition of control prime across sources. They remember the control more when the headlines did not have any particular priming. So for the discussion, recognition was greater for unbelievable than believable headlines, and this fact was influenced by media primes, which supported her hypothesis. The Washington Post label increased the believability of both believable and unbelievable headlines. Additionally, the headlines labeled the Washington Post were more believable than other sources at time 1, but the believability decreased at time 2 when the Washington Post source was moved. Lastly, the results supported the claim that source affects believability.